What's going on, everyone? In today's episode, we're going to be continuing our little two-part mini-series here on troubleshooting zucchini problems. In the last episode, if you have not yet seen that, make sure you go check it out. It is why your plants are only producing male flowers. In this episode, as promised, we're going to talk about once the plants actually produce female flowers and you get fruit set, why sometimes they look like this. If your zucchinis are producing a little beak, I call it, or if they just are misshapen in general, or if they get soft and fall off the plant prematurely, that is what this video is going to help you with. We're going to talk about 3 reasons why you're not getting this, but instead are getting this. Let's go. Now, what causes this is a problem called blossom end rot. Now, blossom end rot you've probably heard of with your tomatoes, but it's the exact same problem that happens with zucchini. And it really boils down to pollination. You see, your zucchini, they are produced from a male and female flower being crossed. Now, that's not like a tomato, which has a perfect flower. Your zucchini has a male and a female flower, and when pollen from the male flower touches the reproductive organs of the female flower, proper fruit set should occur. I say should because there's some things that can happen, as we'll talk about, which can actually kind of inhibit that pollination process. So when it comes to proper pollination, that is really the only reason why you're not getting nice, beautiful zucchini. If your zucchini look like this, it's because something happened in the pollination process. Now, if they look like this and then fall off, we'll get to that in a second. But the next thing I want to talk about is improper pollination from a lack of pollinators. So when it comes to pollinators, obviously it goes without saying, they're the ones that do the pollinating. Things like bees, butterflies, even ants can be pollinators. If you have a lack of pollinators in your garden, you can have a lack of pollination. And so the female flower will still form. The plant will actually still try to set fruit. But what happens is that if it's not successfully pollinated, or if there's not enough pollen, the fruit will form and then the tip will rot off. So that is the first thing, is you got to make sure you have good pollinators. If you don't have enough pollinators in your garden, I would highly encourage you to plant other flowers and things that would attract things like honeybees, bumblebees, any type of pollinator, even butterflies into your garden, because they can all be really beneficial at creating good pollen set on your flowers. Now, if you have a lot of pollinators in the garden, but your plants are still forming fruits and then they're still rotting at the end, blossom end rot, we want to look to the next thing, which is a lack of calcium. So when it comes to calcium, calcium is what's known as a trace mineral. It means it's not part of the macronutrient category, right? Macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, whereas calcium falls into a lesser required, but still equally as important, if not more important in my opinion, category known as micronutrients. And when it comes to calcium, you can get it through a whole host of ways. The first way is through just a good all-purpose fertilizer. Now, we use Trifecta Plus in our garden, and anytime we grow a crop and transition that crop out, we will refertilize. We'll refertilize with good amounts of Trifecta because it has over 70 trace minerals, as well as the macronutrients as well, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so it's really important that you use a good all-purpose fertilizer, but you don't have to if you're using ample amounts of compost. Now, the reason why compost has lots of calcium is because calcium actually makes up the backbone of all living plants. You see, plants do not have a spine like you and I do. They have a cell wall, and the cell wall is what keeps them rigid. Our spine keeps us rigid, and oddly enough, our spine is a bone, and bone is made up of calcium. But the plant's spine is basically calcium. And so when you break down and decompose a plant, you get all of that calcium released back into the compost, which is awesome. So a lot of soils have ample amounts of calcium, but if you're finding that you're growing in containers with a general potting mix that has a lot of peat moss, or maybe it's coconut husk fiber, something like that, you're going to have a calcium deficiency. And so it is very important that you apply good amounts of calcium. You can also use something like gypsum. You can use dolomitic lime. You can also use, but I'm hesitant to recommend this because a lot of you always ask, well, what about eggshells? Eggshells do have calcium, The problem is that calcium is not readily plant available. We've done lots of videos on debunking this, and it's not that it's wrong, it's just that it's misleading to say that it would add calcium this year. You see, the eggshells, when they're crushed up, can take up to 2 years for that calcium to be made plant available. And so I prefer, if you're having a calcium deficiency, to just add a good all-purpose fertilizer, and you can always throw your eggshells in the compost pile, but just know that it's not going to be ready that year. And so that is the first thing, is ample amounts of calcium. Now, what if you have enough calcium? What if you're growing in like fresh compost, but you're still having problems? And we have problems. You saw the fruits that I had. We have a lot of good ones, but in between some of the good ones are some bad ones. What causes that? Well, it could be temperature. So like I said, the next problem could be a temperature problem. You see, if you're growing your zucchini and it's really, really hot, that can actually cause pollen to become denatured. You see, if you're growing in temperature that's over 105 degrees, it can actually cause the pollen to be untwisted, right? The DNA inside of the pollen, that basically once they are successfully pollinated, that DNA that comes from the male pollen can get untwisted, believe it or not, and it can actually cause problems like mutations or just bad fruit set in general. It can actually kill off the pollen so it becomes sterile. And so that is a big problem if you're growing it in really hot weather. Now, to remedy that, obviously, you could just be patient, wait for the weather to break, or you could use something like shade cloth. Shade cloth, at a 30% shade cloth, you could drape it over your beds, and it would really help to cut down on that heat because it's just less solar radiation hitting your plants. Now, the other side of the coin is if it's too cold. And if it's too cold, that generally will have a lack of pollination because there's less pollinators. Bees don't like to come out when it's cold. But also, pollen, when it's cold, also kind of coincides with cold and damp. Cold and damp weather in like early spring season, you'll have a lot of blossom end rot simply because the pollen gets moldy. And so in very early season and in very kind of hot weather, kind of the peak season, you can have some problems depending on how your weather is, and that is a huge reason that causes blossom end rot. Now, I wanted to touch on one final thing here with blossom end rot because it's very important to talk about, and it ties into calcium, and it's infrequent watering. Now, the reason why this is so important is because if you're watering your crops and then you let your plants dry out and then you water them again, that infrequent watering can actually cause the plants not to be able to uptake calcium. You see, like I said, a lot of soil has calcium in it. And you may add even additional calcium with things like your dolomitic lime, trifecta, fertilizer, whatever, but that calcium cannot be uptaken by the plant if there's not sufficient water. And to fix this inconsistent watering, it's really simple. We use stuff like mulch. Mulch is a really great way to conserve moisture in the soil. Now, in our walkways, we use wood chips. You can also use wood chips as a mulch in your garden beds if you want. You can also use things like straw. Straw is an awesome mulch because it helps to hold moisture as well as the heat. It keeps the heat out of the soil, right? It keeps the coolness in your soil, helps keep the moisture in your soil, and that's all really great for helping keep your zucchinis less stressed and keep those fruits producing. Also, you can also just practice more frequent watering during the hotter periods. Making a mental note of coming out and watering a little more frequently can be a huge help. We will actually water our zucchinis about twice as frequently as we water the rest of our garden. Now, tomatoes are another thing. We'll talk about tomatoes in a later episode, but tomatoes also suffer from blossom end rot when it comes to infrequent watering as well. Same thing. Calcium is often in the soil, but they can't take it up because there's not enough water. And so we will also water our tomatoes slightly more as well, but those two crops get more water than the rest of the garden because of that problem, because they're so prone to blossom end rot. And then finally, we practice what's called core gardening. Now, core gardening is really awesome because what we do is we actually bury straw in our beds. And we bury straw in our beds, and it's rotted straw. So it actually helps to hold on to water like a sponge. Now, core gardening is something we rely on more than anything, more than mulch, more than just watering more frequently, making that mental note, is by using cores. And what we do is we dig a trench. We dig a trench that's about 8 to 10 inches wide by about 8 to 10 inches deep. And we then will take rotted straw in the early season and we will load that straw into our beds. And what it does is it actually absorbs water during periods of excess rainfall, or if you water your beds, it'll store the water in that like a sponge. And then what happens is, due to a process called capillary action basically wants to create equilibrium. Everything should be the same consistency. So what it will do is it will pull water from the areas of excess water to areas where it's a little drier. And that gives you consistent water even when it tends to be drier. And so what we do, like I said, we just take that 8 to 10 inches wide, 8 to 10 inches deep. If you want to learn more about core gardening, you can watch to your heart's content. We've done a ton of videos on it. It is absolutely game-changing. We've been doing it for years now, and it's simply the best gardening method. We even wrote about it in our book, The Autopilot Garden. It is simply the best. And so once we get our rotted straw in, we don't have any rotted straw right now, but in the fall, we'll pick some up along the sides of the roads. When people throw it out after Halloween and Thanksgiving, we'll bring it back. We layer our beds with it. It sits there and it rots. And then in the spring, what we do is we lay our straw down and we cover it up. So pretend like we just put straw down, we cover it back up. After we cover it back up, it's gonna be kind of mounded up. Over time, that'll settle. We'll plant right on top of it. A lot of you are probably wondering, well, Luke, doesn't that steal nitrogen from the soil? No, it doesn't, because we fertilize very heavily. We have a lot of fertility in the soil. It is awesome. And that straw is already starting to rot, which is key. We also will plant right on top of it, because that way it helps the roots of the plants get down into that core. We want the core to be what the roots grow into. Even though it's not necessarily soil yet, it will be soil eventually, but it helps to hold onto that water so your plants stay drought free. And then, ant crawling on me. It's like the Wild West in here. But once you get once the plants get the roots into that core, they start to thrive. And those are the big reasons why your plants will produce fruit and then drop them. Or produce fruit, it'll rot and then drop. And so I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you all learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you share this video with a friend if you think they'd enjoy it, because I definitely think this information is just not widely talked enough about, and I think a lot of you could take this and take your garden to the next level with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you all learned something new. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care. Bye. Hey, thank you so much for watching today's video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, consider checking this one out. You'll probably enjoy it just as much. I want to thank you so much for your viewership, because without it, this channel would not be as amazing as it is. If you haven't subscribed yet, it's free. Consider doing that. We upload every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, rain or shine. And if you need any garden tools, supplies, or seeds, check out MIgardener.com. We got you covered. See you guys in the garden. Bye.